What comes to your mind when you hear the IMF? For most people, it's just another three-letter institution. Distant, technical, something that exists in reports and headlines, not in real life. But for me, there's one number I can't ignore. Just one. In 2023, developing nations spent more than $1.4 trillion solely on interest payments, a staggering figure that does not even begin to reduce the original debt itself. This money did not build factories, improve productivity, or raise living standards. It did not create jobs or strengthen domestic industries. It simply paid for time borrowed from a system in which repayment never truly brings relief, only postponement. Every dollar sent to service interest is a dollar removed from a country's future before that future has a chance to take shape. What makes this burden especially damaging is not only its size, but where the money goes. These interest payments do not circulate within local economies. They flow outward, toward financial centers in the West to institutions and creditors far removed from the social consequences of austerity. While balance sheets are satisfied abroad, governments at home face impossible choices. Classrooms remain overcrowded, hospitals underfunded, and infrastructure projects indefinitely delayed. Debt servicing becomes a higher priority than human development, not because it is more urgent, but because failure to comply threatens economic isolation and collapse. Over the long term, this pattern reveals something deeper than poor financial management. Over several decades, tens of trillions of dollars have been extracted from the global south through interest payments, underpriced exports, overpriced imports, and profits repatriated by foreign investors. This is not a one-time shock or an accidental imbalance. It is a persistent, structural flow of wealth moving in one direction. Capital enters briefly as loans, then leaves permanently as interest and profit. As a result, development becomes an illusion sustained by short-term inflows, while long-term resources drain away. Growth may appear in statistics, but it rests on fragile foundations. When debt absorbs public budgets year after year, progress is no longer delayed, it is systematically denied. What remains is an economy running in place, locked into a cycle where paying yesterday's obligations consumes tomorrow's possibilities. This outward flow of wealth does not occur in a vacuum. It is organized, managed, and enforced through institutions that sit at the very center of the global financial system. Chief among them is the International Monetary Fund, an institution often presented as a neutral lender of last resort, but one that functions in practice as a global enforcer of debt discipline. While its public mandate speaks the language of stability and assistance, its real power lies in its ability to decide who receives financial oxygen and under what conditions. The IMF does not simply provide loans, it sets the terms on which survival is granted. When a country runs out of foreign currency, when markets close and creditors retreat, the IMF steps in as the gatekeeper. Access to emergency funding, to international credit markets, and even to aid from other institutions is frequently conditioned on IMF approval. In this role, the fund does not act as a passive helper, but as an authority that rewrites national economic priorities from the outside. Governments are no longer negotiating freely. They are complying under pressure. Despite being labeled an international organization, the IMF's internal power structure tells a very different story. Voting rights are not distributed equally among its nearly 190 member states. They are weighted by financial contribution, which means that the richest economies dominate decision-making. The United States alone holds effective veto power over major policy changes, ensuring that no reform can pass without its consent. Taken together, countries of the global north command vastly more voting power than the entire global south combined. The result is an institution that governs the economic futures of poorer nations while remaining firmly controlled by wealthier ones. This imbalance has profound consequences. Policies imposed through IMF programs tend to reflect the priorities of creditors rather than the needs of debtor societies. Stability is defined narrowly as repayment. Reform is measured by fiscal discipline, not social outcomes. In this framework, sovereignty becomes conditional. Economic policy is no longer shaped primarily by domestic debate or democratic choice, but by external approval. The IMF, in effect, transforms debt into leverage and leverage into control, locking developing nations into a system where the rules are written elsewhere, and dissent carries a price few can afford to pay. Once this imbalance of power is understood, the nature of modern control becomes clearer. The system no longer relies on occupation or open coercion, yet its effects are no less constraining. What has changed is not the outcome, but the method. Colonialism did not disappear. It evolved. Where armies once crossed borders, debt now does the work. Where governors once ruled from capitals, interest rates, loan conditions, and economic policies are imposed from thousands of miles away, written in financial language rather than military orders. In this new form of domination, sovereignty is not seized overnight, it is gradually surrendered. Countries facing financial collapse are presented with a stark choice: comply or fall. Loans arrive framed as rescue, but they come embedded with obligations that reach far beyond repayment schedules. Budget priorities are rewritten, subsidies are removed, public assets are sold, social programs are reduced. None of these decisions are voted on by citizens, yet all reshape daily life. Economic policy becomes less a matter of national strategy and more a checklist designed to reassure external creditors. The most striking feature of this system is how normalized it has become. There are no flags lowered, no declarations of defeat. Instead, compliance is described as reform, discipline, or modernization. Yet the result is the same familiar pattern. Decision-making power shifts outward, while domestic institutions are left managing the social consequences. Governments remain formally independent, but their room to maneuver shrinks with every loan agreement. Survival is granted conditionally, and autonomy becomes negotiable. Debt, in this sense, functions as a quiet instrument of control. It binds countries into long-term dependence without the visibility of force. High interest payments ensure that resources flow outward, while policy conditions ensure that alternative paths remain closed. Development strategies that prioritize local industry, public investment, or social protection are labeled irresponsible if they conflict with repayment. Over time, nations are trained to govern themselves according to external expectations. This is why modern debt resembles a new form of empire, one without colonies on maps, but with real consequences on the ground. Power is exercised not through conquest, but through contracts. And the price of access to global finance is often the same as it has always been: the quiet exchange of sovereignty for survival. To understand how debt became such an effective instrument of control, it is necessary to look back to the moment when many nations first entered the modern international system. The roots of today's financial dependence lie not in recent mismanagement, but in the historical conditions inherited at independence. When colonial rule formally ended across Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America, political freedom arrived long before economic readiness. New states emerged into a world economy they had never been allowed to shape. Most post-colonial countries began their independence with profound structural disadvantages. They lacked industrial bases capable of producing finished goods. Infrastructure existed, but it was narrow and extractive railways and roads designed to move raw materials from inland regions to coastal ports, not to connect domestic markets or support diversified growth. Capital was scarce, technical expertise limited, and domestic financial systems underdeveloped. What colonial administrations left behind was not a foundation for development, but an economy hollowed out for export. Compounding these weaknesses were borders drawn with little regard for history, culture, or economic logic. Arbitrary lines split communities, forced rivals together, and locked fragile states into permanent instability. At the same time, colonial extraction had drained savings, skills, and surplus wealth outward for generations. Independence, therefore, did not begin on a clean slate. It began with debt, division, and dependency already embedded in the system. Faced with the immediate pressures of governance, feeding populations, stabilizing currencies, and building basic institutions, many newly independent nations turned to borrowing. They entered global finance not as equal participants, but as desperate entrants seeking survival capital. It was at this point that they encountered a financial architecture designed decades earlier, in the aftermath of World War II. Institutions such as the International Monetary Fund were created to stabilize a war-torn global economy, but they reflected the priorities and power structures of the victors who designed them. For post-colonial states, joining this system was less a choice than a necessity. Access to foreign currency, trade, and credit flowed through institutions they did not control and rules they did not write. What followed was not simply borrowing, but incorporation into a framework where development paths were predefined. The historical imbalance between those who designed the system and those who later depended on it ensured that debt would become more than a financial tool. It would become a structural condition, shaping the possibilities of independence itself. What followed this historical entry into the global financial system was, at first, framed as a temporary solution. The early mandate of the International Monetary Fund was narrow and technical. It was designed to provide short-term loans to countries facing balance of payments crises, giving them breathing room when currencies collapsed or imports suddenly outweighed exports. These interventions were meant to stabilize economies, restore confidence, and then quietly withdraw once normal conditions returned. The assumption was simple. The problem was liquidity, not structure, and time was all that was needed. That assumption collapsed in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. A series of global shocks, the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, oil price explosions, rising interest rates in industrialized countries, and slowing global growth turned short-term borrowing into a permanent condition. Developing nations that had borrowed to survive suddenly found their debts multiplying beyond control. What had begun as temporary assistance hardened into chronic dependence. The IMF stepped back in, but the nature of its intervention had fundamentally changed. This new phase introduced structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, a set of sweeping economic reforms attached to IMF lending. These were no longer technical fixes. They reached deep into the core of national economies. Governments were required to cut public spending, devalue currencies, privatize state-owned enterprises, liberalize trade, and dismantle protections for local industries. Access to new loans and even to existing ones depended on compliance. The message was clear. Reform first, survival later. As criticism of SAPs grew due to rising poverty, unemployment, and social unrest, the IMF did not abandon the model. Instead, it rebranded it. Structural adjustment became conditionality, a softer term that obscured the same underlying logic. Loans were now released in tranches, each tied to specific policy benchmarks. Miss one target, and funding was frozen. Economic management became a continuous negotiation under threat, with national budgets shaped more by external approval than domestic priorities. This is how short-term rescue quietly transformed into a long-term trap. Countries entered IMF programs to escape crisis, but found it increasingly difficult to exit them. Each round of reforms weakened domestic capacity, making future crises more likely, not less. Over time, debt ceased to be an emergency and became a permanent, governing framework. What was sold as stabilization evolved into a system of control, one that locked nations into cycles of adjustment, dependence, and repayment, with no clear endpoint in sight. Once countries were locked into this cycle of adjustment and dependence, the content of IMF programs followed a remarkably consistent script. Regardless of geography or history, the conditions attached to IMF lending were built around the same core priorities. Public spending was cut in the name of fiscal discipline, and subsidies for food, fuel, and basic services were reduced or eliminated. These measures were justified as necessary corrections, yet they immediately shifted the burden of adjustment onto ordinary citizens, raising living costs while shrinking the social safety net. At the same time, governments were pressured to privatize state-owned enterprises. Utilities, transport systems, mines, banks, and energy companies often built over decades were sold off, frequently at undervalued prices. The rationale was efficiency and competitiveness. In practice, ownership moved from public hands into private, often foreign-controlled ones. Strategic assets that once generated public revenue were transformed into profit streams flowing outward, while governments lost both income and policy control. Market liberalization formed the next pillar. Trade barriers were dismantled, tariffs reduced, and protections for local industries removed. Domestic producers were suddenly exposed to competition from multinational firms with vastly superior capital, technology, and global supply chains. Predictably, many local factories could not survive. Manufacturing capacity eroded, supply chains collapsed, and economies became increasingly dependent on exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. What was labeled integration into global markets often meant deindustrialization at home. Tax systems were also redesigned, not primarily to fund development, but to reassure creditors. Priority was given to reliable debt repayment rather than long-term public investment. Fiscal success was measured by balanced budgets and timely payments, not by employment, productivity, or social outcomes. In this framework, the economy was judged healthy if numbers aligned even as living standards deteriorated. The result was a pattern of growth that existed largely on paper. GDP figures could improve while unemployment rose. Wages stagnated or fell as labor protections weakened. Domestic industries collapsed under external pressure, and profits increasingly flowed back to foreign investors rather than being reinvested locally. What appeared as reform in spreadsheets translated into insecurity on the ground. This is the contradiction at the heart of IMF conditionality. By prioritizing repayment above all else, the system often undermines the very economic foundations needed for sustainable growth. Stability is achieved statistically, but at the cost of productive capacity and social cohesion. In the end, economies may look compliant from afar, yet hollow from within, meeting financial benchmarks, while steadily losing the ability to generate broad-based prosperity. As these economic adjustments reshaped budgets and markets, their deepest impact was felt not in financial reports, but in everyday life. Once fiscal targets became the primary measure of success, social spending was almost always the first casualty. Healthcare budgets were reduced, education systems were trimmed, and social protection programs were scaled back or eliminated altogether. Clinics closed or began charging fees. Schools became overcrowded, understaffed, and underfunded. What had once been treated as public goods were gradually reframed as costs to be minimized. Over time, this produced consequences that extended far beyond any single budget cycle. Entire generations grew up under permanent austerity, knowing economic stability only as a condition tied to sacrifice. Children entered classrooms with fewer resources, poorer nutrition, and limited prospects. Young adults faced labor markets defined by insecurity rather than opportunity, where stable employment was rare and wages steadily lost purchasing power. Austerity ceased to be a temporary response to crisis and became the environment in which life unfolded. The social contract itself began to erode. When governments are forced to prioritize debt service over public welfare year after year, trust in institutions weakens. Citizens are asked to accept hardship in the name of reform, yet the promised benefits rarely materialize. Instead, inequality widens. Those with access to capital, export markets, or political connections adapt and often profit. The rest absorb the costs through reduced services, lower incomes, and diminished mobility. Poverty becomes more entrenched, not because societies stop working, but because the rewards of work are increasingly disconnected from well-being. What makes this outcome particularly damaging is its cumulative nature. Cuts to education do not simply lower test scores, they reduce future productivity and limit long-term growth. Underfunded health systems do not only increase immediate suffering, they weaken the labor force and raise costs later. Each round of austerity compounds the next, creating societies that are less resilient and more vulnerable to future shocks. In this way, economic adjustment translates into social regression. While balance sheets may improve, human capital deteriorates. Stability is achieved by transferring risk downward, from financial systems to households. The result is a widening gap between those insulated from austerity and those shaped by it, a divide that transforms inequality from a temporary condition into a structural feature of everyday life. These social consequences are not isolated outcomes confined to a single region. When examined across continents, the same pattern reappears with striking consistency, suggesting not coincidence, but design. Nowhere is this clearer than in Africa, where decades of IMF-led reforms were meant to deliver growth and integration into the global economy. Instead, overall economic expansion remained weak, industrial capacity declined, and the continent's share of global exports collapsed. Manufacturing shrank, value-added production failed to take root, and many economies became increasingly dependent on raw material exports, highly exposed to price swings they could not control. Within this broader pattern, individual country cases reveal the mechanics in sharper detail. In Zambia, IMF-backed restructuring pushed the rapid privatization of copper mines, the backbone of the national economy. These assets were sold to foreign firms at heavily discounted prices under the promise of efficiency and investment. What followed was not prosperity but lost public revenue, rising unemployment, and the erosion of state control over strategic resources. Zambia remained a major copper producer, yet captured only a fraction of the value generated, as profits flowed outward while public services were squeezed at home. A similar script unfolded in Argentina during the 1,990 seconds. Under IMF guidance, key industries and public utilities were privatized, capital flowed in briefly, and the economy appeared stable until it wasn't. By 2001, the model collapsed spectacularly. Banks froze deposits, the currency imploded, and millions were pushed into poverty almost overnight. The reforms had created an economy vulnerable to sudden reversal, with little capacity to absorb shock once external confidence evaporated. The same logic was applied, under a different label, in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. Shock therapy promised rapid transition to a free market. Instead, state assets were sold off at fire sale prices, industrial systems disintegrated, and a small group of insiders emerged as oligarchs by acquiring vast national wealth for pennies. Economic freedom arrived, but ownership concentrated sharply, while living standards for much of the population collapsed. Across these cases, geography changes, ideology shifts, and political systems differ, but the outcome remains familiar. Strategic assets are transferred, domestic capacity weakens, inequality deepens, and control migrates outward. The repetition itself is the evidence. When the same results appear again and again across vastly different societies, it becomes harder to argue failure. What emerges instead is a system that functions exactly as intended for those positioned to benefit from it. Taken together, these repeated outcomes point toward a conclusion that is difficult to ignore. The International Monetary Fund cannot be understood merely as a neutral crisis manager or a benevolent lender of last resort. In practice, it functions as a central pillar of a broader system designed to safeguard the interests of powerful creditor nations and global financial elites. Its role is not limited to restoring stability. It actively enforces a set of priorities in which repayment comes first, regardless of social cost or long-term developmental damage. The language of reform used to justify IMF programs suggests modernization, efficiency, and progress. Yet when examined over time, these reforms rarely build resilient, self-sustaining economies. Instead, they restructure countries to remain permanently compatible with debt servicing. Public sectors are reduced, strategic assets are transferred, and domestic policy space is narrowed, all in the name of credibility and discipline. Growth, when it appears, is often shallow and externally dependent. What matters most is not whether societies thrive, but whether payments continue uninterrupted. This is why IMF-led adjustments so often fail to produce lasting development. Sustainable growth requires investment in people, industry, and long-term capacity. Debt-centered reform does the opposite. It prioritizes short-term financial signals over structural strength, rewarding compliance rather than resilience. Over time, nations become efficient at paying creditors while growing weaker at meeting the needs of their own populations. The system does not collapse under these conditions. It stabilizes itself by shifting risk downward and outward. The final question, then, is not whether the IMF occasionally prevents financial meltdown. It often does. The deeper question is whose stability it ultimately serves. When economies are reorganized primarily to guarantee repayment, when sovereignty becomes conditional on approval from abroad, and when social costs are treated as acceptable collateral damage, the answer becomes clearer. This is not a system designed to uplift the many, but one structured to protect the few. So we are left with a choice of interpretation. Is the IMF truly rescuing economies, or is it preserving an international order that benefits those already in control? That question matters not only for policymakers, but for anyone living with the consequences of debt-driven reform. If you found this analysis valuable, leave a comment and share your perspective. And if you want more in-depth explorations like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps bring clarity to systems that are rarely questioned but deeply felt.